Hi, everybody. Really glad that you can join us today. I guess to start, I would just ask everybody right now to remain muted. And then when we come to do the Q&A at the end of Mr. Hirschhorn's presentation, then you can raise your hands and unmute yourself when you're called on, or you can ask questions in the chat. So, as director of the Comparative and International Law Institute and as faculty advisor to the International Law Student Organization that co-sponsors of this event, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our speaker, Eric Hirschhorn. We're delighted and honored that he can be with us today to speak about his distinguished career in international law, which has included serving the federal government as Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security and heading the Bureau of Industry and Security, which, among other things, administers U.S. export controls on commercial and military items and restricts imports for national security reasons under federal statute. He's also worked in private practice, including as a partner at the international law firm of Winston and Strawn LLP, where his practice included advising clients about export controls and economic sanctions, as well as financing and other aspects of international transactions. So in his talk, he will discuss his career in more detail. And as I said at the conclusion of his remarks, he's kindly offered to take your questions. So you can raise your hand to ask a question or submit your questions in writing to the chat, and we'll do our best to monitor those. So I'd like to thank a few people whose work helped make this event possible. Kaylee McGraw, who is the president of our International Law Students Association. And I'll just pause to invite students who are interested in international law to get involved in the organization because Kaylee is graduating this year and we need new leadership. Joe Ferraro, the law school's director of marketing and communications. Al Washington, the law school's web content manager, who's making this Zoom possible for us. Renee Stack, the assistant director for student life and events. Julie Dietrich, assistant dean for career and professional development. Gemma Forrest, assistant dean for student affairs. And Constantia Dedulis, office of institutes and special programs. So we're so happy to have all of you here today. And without further ado, I will give the floor to you, Mr. Hirschhorn.
Well, thank you, Professor Fischer, and thanks so much for the invitation. I hope that this will mostly be questions and answers because the important thing is to, I think, talk about what you guys care about and are curious about and are interested in, not so much what I'm interested in or think you're interested in. But at the risk of sounding like a graduation speaker, I thought I'd start with 4 lessons that don't particularly relate to the international field, but that I've learned in the decades since I graduated from law school, and you may find them useful. You probably have heard some of them before. First, in your career path, a working hypothesis is better than a rigid plan. Indeed, no hypothesis at all is probably better than a rigid plan. Let's see what happens. It allows you flexibility. It allows you to have openness to unanticipated paths. And many of my career paths have been unanticipated. Don't be too focused on checking the right boxes. Because one of the great things about a law degree is that it can lead to all kinds of interesting things, many of which are not the practice of law. And similarly, try not to overspecify what you might want to do. I used to interview law students for my firm, and nothing would frighten me more than someone who'd say, I've always wanted to be an international tax lawyer. Because my reaction to that was, oh God, what if we can't find enough international tax work to keep this poor woman happy? You know, better to say wide open. I'm interested in international, but I'll do whatever is needed. That's you know, you don't have to be too focused too early in your career. Second, money is a factor, but only up to a point. Once you're earning enough to live comfortably, and I expect that everybody on this call, and indeed all your classmates as well, will do that. More money probably will not make you happier. In looking back, I realized that at least 5 job choices that I've made in my life were for the lower salaried option, and I have no regrets about that. And I'm not on welfare. Last time I checked. The prestige of a job also can be overrated. Don't get too hung up on that. I've had at least one job that looked great on a resume, and I hated going in the morning, and nothing is worth that. Work that you find interesting and enjoyable, work that is with people whose company you like is critical. It's really critical. There's no substitute. Whatever the substance is, if it's a good crowd that you're working with, you'll enjoy it. And if it isn't, no matter how interesting it is, you probably won't. I mean, the job I'm thinking of was very interesting in its substance, but there were factors about it that just made it not much fun, at least for me. Third lesson, you never know where people will turn up. And by that, I mean folks you may be in school with right now, people that you work with as a newly minted lawyer, may come back into your professional life down the road as important contacts for jobs, for client referrals, even as friends, all of those. So be sure to act professionally with everyone you deal with, and especially subordinates. Even if their conduct is provocative, even if you have to make their lives a bit difficult in pursuit of your client's interest. That is part of what lawyers do, whether it's a litigation or a contract negotiation or whatever. I mean, sometimes it's an adversary system that we live in this country. And so sometimes you're going to be an adversary, but you can disagree without being disagreeable. It's worth it. People think of the 2 cities where I have practiced, which are Washington and New York, as big and anonymous, but they can be surprisingly small towns when it comes to professional subcultures. And if you're a jerk, word gets around. And similarly, if you have a reputation for being honest and reliable, if you say you're going to do something or you're going to give somebody an adjournment on a motion, you got to stick with it. You got to stick with it. Your reputation is very important. But people really do pop up in unexpected places. You will be surprised as you go through your professional life. When it multiplied when I had children, because then they pop up on the sidelines of a soccer field, as opposed to across the table in a litigation or a negotiation of some kind. Fourth, finally, get your name out there. There's lots of ways to do that. Participate in groups like the ABA International Law Section, like this group, like the International Law Students Association, adjunct teaching, volunteering for panels at conferences, on whatever specialty you are developing or are interested in developing, writing articles. I think short ones for trade publications are probably better than law review articles. I know there are at least 3 professors on the call, but and I've written a few law review articles, but it's those short, punchy articles that are more likely to get a phone call. And even if they don't ever get a phone call, I think I've gotten 1 client from an article, maybe 2 in a lot of years. If someone's sniffing around as a possible client, the ability to send them an article you've written shows that you're serious about this subject, about this area, and you're not just going to be one day ahead of them. One day ahead of them. When I had to handle a matter for a client that would raise novel legal issues, I would always try to see if I could turn it into an article. You have to make it generic, and but it's if it's a legal issue for this client, it probably will be a legal issue for another client down the road. And I always got the client's permission, and I don't think I ever had a client turn me down. There were 1 or 2 who wanted to review the text to make sure it didn't identify them, but ultimately, if anything, they were pleased to have their issue, the subject of something published that supported their position. So I don't think that was I don't think that was ever a negative. As far as specialties are concerned, I ended up developing 3 of them. One of them was export controls and economic sanctions, which is kind of the area I'm known a little bit in. Also foreign investment in the United States, but also lawyers' professional responsibility and railroad litigation, of all things. I never expected to be an expert in any of them. They were all completely happenstance. I was working in a small law firm, and the lawyer who handled conflicts and professional responsibility issues had a stroke. And the managing partner came to me and said, could you handle Joe's conflicts and professional responsibility work, which was probably 10% of his time, and it ended up being 10% of my time, until he comes back full time, which he never did. And I said, I don't know much about it. I didn't even take the course in law school. I'm pre-Watergate and it wasn't required, and I never took it. He said, well, your wife teaches it, just call her up. So that's how I fell into that. International came in a different way. I had worked for a congresswoman who ran for the Senate and was defeated. I was job hunting and went to talk to a committee staff person in the Senate about a job there. And in the middle of the conversation, this was a Saturday afternoon over a couple of sandwiches, he said, have you thought of working for the new administration, which was the Carter administration? I said, I wasn't involved in the campaign. I don't know anybody. He said, well, I know a few people, and they're putting together a presidential staff to do government reorganization. So can I send them your resume? And one thing led to another, and I got hired. And since I was one of the first people hired, and at this point I had no international work at all, I was one of the first people hired. They said, well, here are the 8 groups: education, health, economics, national security and international affairs. You're one of the first people. Which one do you want to be in? I said, oh, national security and international affairs. And that's how it happened. I was already 9 years out of law school at the time. So it wasn't something I always wanted. Indeed, I took one international course in law school. It was taught by the most boring person who ever walked the face of the earth. He was a pompous partner from a big law firm, and I hated it. So it's not as though international was something I was interested in when I was a law student or even shortly after that. Same thing with railroad litigation. I was in the litigation group at my law firm. It was late August. Everybody else was still at the beach, but because Catholic starts early, and my wife was teaching there, we were already back. So there was like nobody around. So there was an emergency application to the DC Circuit on a railroad condemnation case. And I got dragged into it, and they eventually ended up as my biggest client. Not my favorite client, but my biggest client. So, awful lot of it is just things that happen, paths that open, doors that open. So, and people sometimes ask me about what I consider to be international law, just turning to the subject that we're supposed to be talking about. And when I was a law student, one of the student groups would bring in practitioners, and this was in New York. So bring in practitioners who would talk for a brown bag lunch, and you bring a lunch to the big classroom. And the lawyer would talk about whatever his or her specialty was. So one day they had a guy who was billed as an entertainment lawyer. Okay, an entertainment lawyer. Well, that sounded pretty interesting, and it drew a pretty good crowd. So he's up there and he says, okay, I see a lot of you are interested in entertainment law, but I wonder how many of you know what entertainment law is. Entertainment law, I'm going to bring this up to date for those of you who were not around in 1966, okay? Entertainment law is when J-Lo's cleaner loses her new dress. And when Ben Affleck's landlord wants to throw him out for having loud parties. That's what entertainment law is. And to a large degree, that's what international law is too. the first international matter I ever had was a lawsuit by a supplier of energy, solar energy equipment, to the government of Pakistan, the Ministry of Energy at the government of Pakistan. And, suing a foreign government is a big deal. And I had to, bone up on the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, very interesting. And at that point, it was only about 10 years old. So it was a pretty new statute and largely untested. But once we got through the motion to dismiss, and the court, the district court here in Washington, found that there was jurisdiction under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, it was just an ordinary garden variety contract case. My client said we furnished the equipment, it was on time and it works very well. And the Pakistani government said it was late and it stinks. And, it was just at that point a regular contract case. So that's, some example of what international law can be. You shouldn't be too, there is public international law, which is, the Libya-Tunisia boundary dispute and the Corfu Channel case. And I wouldn't overlook that, but very few lawyers outside the United Nations and the State Department Legal Advisor's Office practice what I would call public international law. Most international matters are private, between private parties, or sometimes if it's an investment dispute, maybe between a private party and a foreign government. But they rarely are public international law. Most international law work as such is private international law. So, okay, assuming there is such a thing as international law, and there certainly is to a degree, where do you find it? And in large measure, it's where you find domestic legal practice. Law firms, typically the larger ones, but not always. There are some small firms. I was in a 7-lawyer firm in the 80s that did only international work. Did dumping, countervailing duties, Section 301 cases. I did export controls and economic sanctions. So that's all it did. And it was a 7-lawyer firm in Georgetown with a great view of the river, by the way. You don't get that downtown. The federal government, even with what's going on now, there's going to be plenty of federal government jobs that do international things. In-house corporate offices, non-governmental organizations. There are many charitable organizations, and many of them around DC that are engaged in all kinds of international stuff. Before everybody else came on, I was talking a bit with Professor Fischer about the fact that there's an immigration conference there today, and I was talking with Kaylee McGraw about some work she's doing involving immigrants. I think it's not legal work, but there's legal work as well, and a lot of it, both pro bono and paid. Think tanks, academia, Professor Fischer being Exhibit A, international organizations like the UN, the World Bank Group. I had lunch with an old friend about a week ago who spent her entire career as a lawyer at the International Monetary Fund. And maybe Professor Fischer will get her for a future speaking engagement. I'll give you her information. Regional development banks. There's a number of them located in Washington. The Inter-American Development Bank is in Washington. It's quite a big bank. And the international organizations tend to want to not just hire Americans, even if they're in Washington. So that's a little bit of can be a little bit of a negative, but they do hire plenty of Americans, and they hire people from all over the world as well. So it's a great, those are great places to meet and work with people who are not, don't have the same cultural background that you do. So if you end up doing work that involves the law of multiple countries, you will find that comparison is an excellent generator for critical and conceptual thinking, not only about the foreign laws involved, but about your own country's legal system. To quote my wife, who's on the call and who's an emerita professor at Catholic, who runs the 3 programs in Krakow and has worked in more than 30 countries, stepping out of your own system allows you to see your own system better and to look at it critically. And it's also healthy to see that the way things are done in your legal system are not always the way they're done elsewhere. One way lawyers get into trouble is assuming that the laws or customs are the same everywhere as on their home turf. It ain't true. And you've got to be alert for that. Better to listen, ask questions, Learn as much as you can before you know, someone once said it's better to keep your mouth shut and have people wonder if you're stupid than to open it and convince them. So that's an example of it. Um, being a lawyer in a country with 51 jurisdictions, which all of you are or will be, gives you a bit of a head start on that. But all but one are common law jurisdictions, and so it's not a big start. If you're in Europe, you're going to be in a civil law system almost certainly. So with that, I think enough pontificating. I didn't speak as long as Professor Fischer wanted, but I think it's enough. And I would hope to get a lot of questions.
Thank you so much. And yes, I hope that you guys will ask some questions, because now is your chance to ask Mr. Hirschhorn, whatever interests you about a career in international law. So don't be shy. I know the Zoom format is sometimes a little daunting to people, but please,
And if I don't get any questions, I'm going to recite my whole resume. You will hate it. So please don't.
I have a question. So you mentioned your three specialties. Which one would you say was your favorite?
Oh, I don't know. There was like my three children. I don't have a favorite. I don't have a favorite among my children or among my specialties. Each of them is interesting in its own way. Um, it's interesting because the one that I never ever look at anymore, which is railroad litigation, probably paid more of my mortgage than the other two.
Yeah,
But
money's a
and I enjoyed
factor.
it okay because I enjoyed the craft of practicing law. I hated fighting about money, which you have to do with clients and your partners from time to time. But I enjoyed the craft of it. So in a sense, the specialty almost didn't matter. But those three specialties were all interesting in their own way.
Lucy?
Yes, hi. Mr. Horshorn, I don't know if you remember me, but I was actually one of your interns around 2015.
I
So
recognized you, but I couldn't place you. So
it's fun to reconnect like this. I was wondering, as someone who has a lot of interests in the law and is hoping to narrow them down eventually, what advice would you give? Is it kind of a see what doors open and walk through them and see how you feel about it? What's been your experience?
yes, see what doors open. Be at least be open to different experiences, and you may find. When I was about 5 years out of law school, I went to a big law firm in New York. I'd already worked in Washington and in legal services, and went to a big law firm in New York, and they had a rotation program. And I said, well, but I'm 5 years out. I want to do litigation. Why do I have to go through the rotation program? They said, everybody has to go through the rotation program. And I did 4 months in the corporate group, and I almost opted for it. It was much more interesting than I ever would have imagined. I was working on some mergers and some, corporate licensing issues that were really surprised me that they were interesting. I thought only litigation gets your juices flowing, but it turned out not to be the case. So be open to things like that. And yeah, okay, if you want international and you see an international matter, someone sends a memo around your firm that says, I need someone to do, something cross-border, this or that. Yeah, obviously, if it's of interest to you, you ought to jump at it and try it out and do that. But I think just not quite just drifting down the stream. You can guide it some, but try not to be too rigid about what you think you're interested in, because you may turn out to be wrong, may turn out to be something else, and B, it may not present itself at the right time. So flexibility is key. I mean, again, all three of these specialties were accidental.
Yeah, and I think the point that that you made, that you were 9 years out before you really became involved in anything international, is something that, all you guys should bear in mind, that there's a lot of time. And I think there's sometimes a misconception, oh, I must have a certain package of courses in law school, or a certain externship, or a certain experience, or I will never get anywhere in international law. And that just simply is not the case. There is, evolution of careers, and movement in careers. And Mr. Hirschhorn is here, the embodiment of that for us.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's unusual.
Even when I started doing it 9 years out, was working for Jimmy Carter's staff doing government reorganizations in the international area. The first job that really directly involved international issues, which was export controls and sanctions, I was 12 years out, 1980. So, you know, I don't regret any of the work I did before that. It was all worthwhile, all different.
Yeah, so there's plenty of time, to figure it out and have opportunities come your way. Other questions?
I have another one. So we've been talking a little bit about, getting your name out there, especially now in the digital age, and especially after COVID. How do you put your name out there, amongst all the riffraff that's on social media? How do you not get lost in all of that? What's the best strategy for, networking in the digital age?
I'm probably the worst person on the call to ask that question of. I can tell you what I did, which was volunteer to speak at conferences and even help organize conferences, try to write articles and there are places to put them. The ABA, for example, has a whole bunch of online publications. They're desperate for articles for the most part. If it's a cogent and intelligible, the odds of getting it published, even if it's online rather than in print, are pretty good. And it's something you have in hand, again, to show to potential clients, to pass around your firm so people know, oh, hey, Kaylee wrote an article about the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. Okay, well, we might get a case on that, or might get some other international matter. It's kind of, and some of it is accidental, as I say. I totally blundered into it. So, and I suspect if I'd blundered into something else, it would have been fine also. So, maybe I'm too unfussy. I don't know.
No, I would second that idea of, the sort of professional networking through articles. And you had pointed out, Mr. Hirschhorn, that you recommended trade publications and sort of said, oh, a law professor might not like that. But actually, I do, because in practice, I knew numerous people who sort of guided their careers in directions that they wanted them to take by writing articles, short articles. And this could also include things like blogs or podcasting, using social media, but in a sort of the more professional side of it rather than the kind of, riff-raffy, side of it.
Yeah, don't do cat videos. Not recommended.
Yeah. And it really does work. Your name, we have an alum, this is not in the international space per se, but a student that was interested in fashion law. Her name is Julie Zerbo. And she said, I'm interested in fashion law, this is a bit of a niche field. How do I possibly get into that? And I recommended that she start a blog. And she actually did. And her blog is called The Fashion Law. It's a mix of fashion and law, both things, and it's extremely well known. And she's really gotten her name out there from doing this. And she's really considered to be an expert in fashion law. And she created that through this blog. So you guys can do that and don't be shy about putting yourself out there as knowing something, even if you have to do research to write the article, or even as Mr. Hirschhorn said, maybe it comes from an experience with a client and you can generalize it as he said. I mean, this is a leveling of the playing field for you, the ability to network this way that those of us who started off in the analog age really didn't have, because we had to go through more gatekeepers than you guys will have to. And then also the plethora of publications that are looking for content. That's something people don't realize. that they're looking for you. They need the articles. And so you can pitch, your articles. So that's a really good thing to do and something you can do when you're junior. And then the other thing you can do, I think, is go to professional organization events. As students, you can often get in for free, and maybe as young practitioners as well. So those are things to think about.
Thank you.
Other people?
I'm getting ready to recite my resume. I'm warning you.
I'll ask another one. This is pretty specific to me, but you talk about balancing needing to make enough money to live your life comfortably and life outside of work. As someone who's going to be graduating in her 30s, what sorts of things should I be looking for and prioritizing maybe outside of the sort of accolades that come along with the name of a job as I'm job hunting?
It's so personal. It's hard to say because it's a question of what moves you, what will make you happy. I don't know what will make you happy. But and you may have to try different things before you find one that makes you happy. I started in legal services and I liked it okay, but it was very frustrating. I realized that, that I might get someone's welfare check restored, but I wasn't going to get them off welfare. I might get someone's eviction postponed, but I wasn't going to suddenly get them enough money to pay the rent. That was after 2.5 years of that is when I went into working in the legislative area, where I thought I could do a little more. It's still hard to accomplish things, but you have to, I mean, to some degree, feel your way. And I don't know that starting in your 30s is particularly a problem. It really isn't. You got a lot of years there ahead of you anyway. Um, you may feel less inclined to bounce around. I mean, I changed jobs in every odd numbered year, for quite a few years. 2 years out, 4 years out, 6 years out, and then I stayed with one firm for 29 years. So, I don't think you should be shy, especially in this day and age. I think the younger generation now, there's much more job switching. It's not, nobody looks at you and says, what, you were only there for 2 years? I mean, they're more likely to say, you were there for 2 years? Didn't you get tired of it? That's my sense, just looking at my children and their friends. So I think you shouldn't be shy about moving on or something. I used to find that when the job started to get boring, that's when I'd start looking. So, and I did some interesting things on the way, but none of them snagged me. And so don't be shy about bouncing around.
Thanks.
I think it can be helpful also, maybe, while you're students and beyond, to just do some basic journaling about yourself. You can sort of think about as you take each class, as you have each externship, each summer experience for those of you who are going on the summer program this summer, maybe to Krakow and getting an international perspective there. What do you like about the class you're taking? What really grabs you? What do you like to do in your daily life? You can even think about your hobbies and how they might fit in to a legal career. For example, some of you might have been at the Rights of Nature talk by Professor Sveto. That's an example of him getting involved in sustainable development in nature because he's a rock climber. It's his passion that he spends time in nature and, sort of moving his research in that direction. So I think, as a person, and then just basic things, are you sort of more falling on the extrovert scale or the introvert scale? Do you like to work in teams? Do you prefer to be sitting in a room doing your own research independently? These are just kind of basic personality questions. How in the international phase, how much traveling and living abroad do you want to do? Because you can do international law based entirely in the US, or you can do it in another country. or you could spend some of your career in another country and some of your career in the US, or have traveling and so on. So I do think that kind of some basic introspective, personality analysis is really helpful. And then just kind of having a little book where you're keeping a running record of kind of your observations and you're thinking, oh, well, I had this experience and that taught me this about really what I like, because your career is about meaning for you, and also the idea of, how can you help others in your career, to make the world a better place. And that's something that you can kind of see, what do you like? How can you achieve those things? So I
Yeah.
found that to be personally helpful.
Let me jump back in for Lucy's question. Don't be self-conscious about your age. Very important. Do not. Just don't mention it. Don't bring it up. No, really, don't. I wouldn't feature it on a resume. I would not feature it, but I wouldn't feature it on a resume. Our chief judge for a long time, Pat Wald of our DC circuit, took 10 years, I think at least 10 years off to raise her kids, and then came back to a small firm, and she ended up as chief judge of the DC circuit. So it's not a deal killer. I don't know whether Ruth Ginsburg took time off or not. I suspect she didn't. But certainly Judge Wald did, and it didn't hinder her in any way.
Yeah, I
And
think Justice Ginsburg didn't take time off and indeed concealed her second pregnancy because she was afraid in that day and age that if she showed it, she would be fired. But she did, take jobs in academia and then move, into being a judge after that as a transition. And again, the age was not an issue because, really age is just a number, and as they say in the ad, and it's unlisted. So it's really up to you. And I think people are just much more flexible now about moving around, as Mr. Hirschhorn has said. There isn't a sense that you need to spend your entire career in one place and that anything otherwise is weird. It's the opposite.
Thanks.
Professor Fisher, you're mute.
Oh, oops. Others, now is your chance. This is like one of the most regrettable things about Zoom, is that it does silence people, I have discovered. So
There was one law professor who used to say in his last class, the next time you ask me a question, it'll cost you $500 an hour.
oh, okay. Actually, we have a question here in the chat, so thank you.
Okay.
This question is, do you have advice on cities outside DC to look into for a successful career in private international work? And then the same question, but for public international work as well outside of DC. So thank you for that question.
That's a good question. I think increasingly there are not just San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, New York in this country, and London, Paris, Geneva in Europe, and Beijing and Tokyo. I think there are increasingly other cities that are important in international law. I think bigger cities tend to have more of that kind of thing because that's where big corporations are, and they're often the clients in international law situations. But I think increasingly it's in many more cities than it used to be. When I was a young lawyer, for example, Miami was not seen as an international law city. Today, it's very much an international law city. It's the place if you're going to practice in Latin America, for example. I mean, Miami is in this country, it's the place. You wouldn't want to do that from Chicago. I think it would be pretty tough. But so it's expanded a lot. I think big cities tend to be more of a place to find international work than smaller places. Of course, if you're with a corporation, if you're in-house, a corporation could be the headquarters could be somewhere out in the sticks, and they could have, you know, subsidiaries and operations all over the world. So I have a friend who worked for the Cummins engine company, which is in rural Indiana, and she had stuff going on all over the place. So, you know, if you're in-house, you might be in a not very large city, but still be doing plenty of traveling and maybe have assignments or even, you know, postings overseas. So it's much broader than it used to be, I think, when I got out of law school more than 50 years ago. In those days, it was basically you wanted to practice international law in this country, you went to New York. Period. That was pretty much it. Even Washington was sort of thought of as a second level place. But I think, you know, in that day, it was New York. There were a few firms that were the international firms, like Couder, which I don't even think exists anymore, and you know, a few other big firms, Baker and McKenzie, which does still exist. But now it's lots and lots of firms. I mean, my own firm, Winston Strawn, which has headquarters in Chicago, has offices in, you know, half a dozen foreign countries. That used to be very unusual for a Midwestern firm to have foreign offices, but now it's very common.
Work that's done abroad as well. You know, it used to be heavily branch offices were in London. And again, even though that's still probably the largest place for American firms to have the largest offices abroad, you know, there are many firms that now have offices in many, many countries. You know, if you're thinking about practicing international law outside of the US. And again, that's because of, you know, the kind of globalization that we've seen of business and that people are needed everywhere. So those of you who had experiences in Krakow, you know, seeing how much is going on in not just Warsaw, but also in other cities like Krakow and so on.
I had a roommate in law school who was from a very small town in Indiana, and he had gone to Indiana University and kind of came to the big city to go to law school. And he, after law school, he went to work for American Express, and he ended up as general counsel first to the Arab Banking Corporation in the Middle East, and he spent the last 30 years as in practice in Bangkok, Thailand. So, you know, you can get there a lot of different ways.
Exactly. And then sometimes it might be linguistic skills could be helpful in some jurisdictions where less English is spoken. So even though English is increasingly sort of becoming the lingua franca of the world, as it were, you know, there are places where your daily life might not be in English. And so you have to decide whether that would be something you would welcome or something where you would not be comfortable.
And of course, lawyers with law degrees do lots of things that aren't practicing law. I said that already, but you can do lots of international things also that aren't practicing law. I've known lawyers in the Foreign Service, for example, and, you know, yeah, they had legal training, but they weren't practicing law there. The legal office at state is not Foreign Service. It's all general schedule, as far as I know.
Exactly, or international business, you know, working in-house, you might not be, you know, you might be on the business side rather than in the general counsel's office of an organization, but your legal experience will come in handy and help you in those roles because you're aware, you know, of the laws in a way that other people are not. So, you know, this is really good advice that sometimes you're looking more broadly you know, outside of, you know, a strictly speaking legal position. And, you
You're on
know,
mute, Leah.
I just
You're
have
on
to make a
mute.
comment. Here's another ad for one of our other centers. How much compliance is a very important and very big international area. Compliance, corporate investigations, again, the area that Professor Duggan and Professor Pellannon's center is working on. A lot of the work in Poland, and there are business service centers in Poland. There's 175 in Krakow, about the same number in Warsaw Plus, which do various kinds of back office functions for international corporations. And a big chunk of that work is in compliance, which is very strongly legal.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Actually, Professor Wortham is another example. She grew up on a farm 3 miles from a town of 400 people and ended up spending a lot of her late career in Poland, so, and in 30 or 40 other countries. So, you know, you just follow your nose sometimes. And she didn't start international work until she was more than 20 years out of law school.
25, I think, actually.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so another example that the early part of the career is often not at all an indicator of where the later part of the career will take you. I mean, my first job was in shipping law, which is not a direction that I ended up going into, even though it was actually pretty interesting. And you know, I actually got to arrest a ship. That was kind of cool.
That is cool. Yeah.
Dealing with all kinds of people scuttling their ships and sinking them intentionally and stuff. But you know, and another international area, admiralty law, which you don't think about and which unfortunately we don't even really teach here. But if someone were interested in that, you know, you could come to me and I could give you a little information. And then there's other areas like space law, you know, that is heavily international, which we do teach a course on. So often it is, you know, you might find that in your elective that you take, you might find something really of interest to you that is kind of one of these international but niche areas that you haven't really even thought about in that context.
And whatever course you take, you will learn more about a subject in 3 months of practicing it than in a course in law school. I guarantee it.
I mean, are there any courses that you think for those students that are first years are particularly helpful? You know, bearing in mind that none of these are absolutely necessary.
One of my professors was a man named Walter Gellhorn, who was one of the kings of administrative law. And he used to say, if you think you know what you want to do, take other courses in law school, because those other areas you'll never see again. So I'm not sure that there are any courses I would recommend, because there's so many disparate things that lawyers do. I think just, you know, learning how the law works and getting a sense of that, and taking a few courses elsewhere if you can. I took 1 or 2 courses elsewhere in the university while I was in law school. You were allowed to take up to 6 credits. And I took a sociology course. I took one other course. I don't even remember what it was, but it was worth kind of getting out of the law school straitjacket for a few hours at least.
That is a great piece of advice because the rest, you know, we have a wonderful university out there with all kinds of interesting things. Among other things, something that a few of my students have done that you cannot do anywhere else in the US is take a course in canon law, which I do recommend, regardless of how religious or not religious you might be. It is absolutely fascinating as a comparative exercise to do that, and you would be welcomed. Anyone else? Any other questions? I know it's getting late in the day and people are probably beginning to think about their evening meal. But this is our, you know, and really anything at all. I think you've gotten a lot of really helpful advice to think about.
I would say it's free advice, and I hope you don't feel you overpaid.
I do not think so.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank
I've
you very
enjoyed
much for coming. And this was a really wonderful experience to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to our students. And I know many of them, will really benefit from this when it comes to just thinking about navigating law school and after law school. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a nice evening.
I too.
Bye.